The following review for The Last of Us contains spoilers for the entire game. If you haven't played it, then I'd advise you not to watch this video beforehand. The Last of Us released recently for the PlayStation 3 and follows two survivors on a cross-country trek 20 years after a fungal plague wipes out most of humanity. As is the case with many zombie stories, the game begins by giving us a glimpse of life before everything goes wrong. In this case, the player is put in the shoes of Sarah, the daughter of Joel, the main protagonist. I found it to be an unexpected introduction, and even after finishing the game, playing as Sarah was one of the most memorable moments. The abrupt change to Joel's point of view after the car crash is a bit jarring, but overall the sequence is well scripted. There's an appropriate amount of chaos on screen at all times. Considering Sarah's death scene hits about 15 minutes in, it manages to punch with a lot of emotional weight. Naughty Dog have shown a skill for believable character interactions in the Uncharted series, but The Last of Us puts even those to shame. The character voices, facial animations and body language during the cutscenes are incredibly convincing. I don't know how much of this is down to the actors and how much is down to the animators, but for whatever reason it manages to consistently avoid many of the problems which plague the cutscenes in other games. Stiff voices, awkward pauses or unpolished animations never rear their head, which helps keep the player in the story. It helps that they're all kept short, sweet and to the point. To me, they're one of the few developers capable of crafting cutscenes which don't feel disruptive to the flow of the gameplay. That said, no matter how good you are at crafting cutscenes, there's only so much you can do to make someone care about a character they met a few minutes ago, but at least this sets up Joel's history and informs his decisions for the rest of the game. 20 years later, in the quarantine zone, the proper game gets off to a slow start, and this left me apprehensive about the experience I was in for. The Last of Us essentially introduces itself twice in rapid succession, leaving the player with very little to do other than follow other characters around and press the triangle button from time to time. About half an hour elapses before the player first comes in contact with some infected. The funny thing is, if The Last of Us was a film, I would say it paced its first half hour or so pretty well. It's slow for the first couple of minutes, but then pulls in the viewer early on with some action as Joel and Sarah try to escape the madness. Then, once that's over, it slows back down again. As a story, The Last of Us progresses just fine, but as a game it left me feeling totally unengaged until about half an hour in, and even then it would take another while before I felt it had really started. When it does begin to kick off, it does so with some unintentionally hilarious level design. Joel and Tess walk into a courtyard of perfectly angular, chest-high objects seemingly placed there for no reason at all, and Joel sighs. So did I.
Here we go.
When they finish slaughtering these guys, they eventually end up face to face with another equally contrived vista, and upon seeing it, my heart sank. It's hard to express the level of disappointment I had at this point, particularly since it comes on the heels of 45 minutes of limited interactivity. Those two sections are so bad compared to the other environments in the game, I assume they were either done by an intern or blatantly made this way to ensure even the stupidest players would get the idea. The port section improves after this, but even so it remains a bland environment with which to introduce the player to the game. Thankfully, things start to pick up considerably after Joel is introduced to Ellie, and I'd consider this to be the true start to the game. The escape reinforces the stealth focus by pitting the player against vastly stronger enemies at this point. Before I started playing, I was expecting something closer to the Uncharted series than what I got. The Last of Us sits somewhere between a stealth game, a survival horror, and a third-person shooter. From here, the game falls into a sort of rhythm where it cycles between a few main scenarios several times. There's sections with bandits, some with infected, calmer areas where Joel and Ellie traverse the terrain, a variety of one-off sequences, and some scavenging sprinkled throughout. Since the game is so lengthy and swaps between these different sequences very regularly, it would be pointless for me to talk about every single section, so from here on out I'm going to discuss most stuff in a general sense. Stealth is probably the most important aspect of the gameplay, since it depletes the fewest resources. Players are assisted in this by a hearing mode which highlights nearby enemies through walls. The first time this popped up it was incredibly jarring, since there's no context in the story for Joel to be gifted sonar vision like this. I can understand where the development team were coming from though. It's fairly common that stealth games will give the player some extra tools to make it easier than it would be in reality. That said, with a third-person camera, a player already has a huge advantage over the enemy, since they can look around corners without fear of being detected. As jarring as it was to use the listen mode early on, I found myself getting used to the idea and began to think of it as a substitute for a better speaker system. If we all had surround sound speakers, there'd be no reason for a listen mode to exist, but of course that's not the case. I'm glad to see this mode is disabled on the Survivor difficulty, and there's also an option in the menu to disable it on other difficulties as well, in case a player wants to lock it away from themselves. Early on, the stealth sections focus on the infected. Runners, the recently turned infected, are your basic zombies, but clickers are a more advanced and interesting form. Before even encountering one, the game tells us that they see like bats, hence the clicking noise they make must be used for echolocation.
So what, are they blind? Sort of. They see using sound. Like bats? Like bats. If you hear one clicking, you gotta hide. That's how they spot you.
In gameplay terms, this equates to walking quietly, or the clickers will notice your presence, but this makes no sense. Since the clickers are constantly making a clicking noise, they're constantly sending out pulses of sound which they can use to detect their environment. Whether its prey is making noise or not makes no difference. If a clicker was incapable of seeing stationary objects, then it would be prone to walking into walls and other things, but that never happens. Now, they're an interesting enemy, probably the best one in the game because of the amount of tension they bring to a level, but their design and their behaviour doesn't really match up. They don't see using sound, they just hear stuff like anyone else. Sections where the player has to crawl past a pack of clickers end up being some of the most enjoyable and tense stuff in the game, but it can also highlight one of the biggest issues, the AI. Clickers are hypersensitive to sound, and in some cases just breaking into a run is enough to cause a swarm of them to rain down on Joel, but the allied AI staggers around as loudly as they want.
Hold up, I got a key for that gate. I suggest we move quietly.
Occasionally they'll even bump right into enemies they're supposed to be hiding from. This has no consequences for Joel as the game wisely stops the allied AI from triggering detection, but it's immersion shattering to say the least. I have no doubt a lot of effort went into the AI for Ellie, but the end result is disappointing. I get the feeling the developers were trying to be a little too smart about the way they handled things, instead of just relying on simple solutions to their problems. For example, the allies and enemy AI should never be able to just bump into one another, but this probably happens because they have no direct connection to one another. Ellie's AI should probably secretly collude with the enemy AI to ensure she never walks into their line of sight by repositioning one of them should they get close to each other. Even simpler than that, Ellie should always follow the player's lead. In other words, if Joel is crouching, Ellie should be crouching. If he's walking slowly, Ellie should be walking slowly. When he runs, she runs. It's a crude solution, sure, and exploitable in its own way to make Ellie do stupid things, but at least she wouldn't be doing stupid things by herself. The player would have to be actively trying to ruin their own immersion to make it happen. One of the greatest strengths of The Last of Us is how engrossing it can feel at times. The combat, environment and various set pieces work very well together to pull the player in, but the AI partners mostly get in the way. At times they can show a glimmer of brilliance, like when Ellie warns Joel of an off-screen threat or she saves him from an infected, but these moments are few and far between, and not nearly enough to make up for all the flaws. It says volumes that most of the more involving sections are when the player is left to experience the game solo. The basement sequence in the hotel is easily the most frightening part, and the winter chapter as Ellie is one of the highlights. This leads me to question whether I should call The Last of Us a success at all, despite most of the other elements working perfectly as intended. What is the point of including Ellie as a partner for the vast majority of the game, if not for us to bond with her? And how am I expected to take that notion seriously when the AI has so many issues? The only times I felt this relationship worked were during the scripted sequences or conversations during the calm sections.
Teamwork.
This is a big disadvantage with story-first game design. It was built from the ground up to be about Joel and Ellie, so even though the AI wasn't up to the task, they couldn't just pull it out. It might have been too ambitious a goal to have a stealth game with a constant companion, but by the time they figured that out, most of the cutscenes were probably done. The enemy AI fares quite a bit better, but still falls into extremes where it can act brilliantly or amazingly stupid for seemingly no reason. At its best, the enemies will show a strong desire for self-preservation. Sometimes when I got caught in a shooting section, I would wait behind some cover for the enemy to inevitably pop his head out and shoot it whack-a-mole style like every other shooting game from the past 5 years, only to be left waiting in a standoff where neither of us wanted to reveal ourselves. Even better, the enemies will sometimes take these opportunities to quietly flank the player in a believable way. Once I noticed this behaviour, it left me constantly paranoid that someone was trying to sneak up on me during a firefight, which in turn led me to flee backwards a bit. This all felt very natural, like a tug of war. It's not surprising Naughty Dog decided to call this the balance of power system. If enemies detect they have the upper hand, they're more brazen, and vice versa. Unfortunately, despite its cleverness at times, it can still fall back into some basic issues, which can be very destructive to the experience. The AI is by far the biggest black mark against The Last of Us, to the point where I don't think the game should have been shipped with these issues still intact. There's no way Naughty Dog are happy with the systems they have in place at the moment, which shows that the game is sadly constrained by its technology, at least somewhat. To sum it all up visually, this is how the AI felt in The Last of Us. One area Naughty Dog have never had any trouble with are graphics, and The Last of Us is no exception. It pushes the PS3 to its absolute limit. The graphics fall into a weird sort of area. On the one hand, it's extremely impressive what Naughty Dog have managed to pull off, but it also suffers because it comes at a point where the PS4 is just around the corner. As impressed as I was with the visuals, I was also lamenting how much better it would have looked in 1080p resolution with some proper anti-aliasing. To be fair though, I can't fault The Last of Us for that. As far as PS3 games go, it's the most visually impressive one I've played, and still managed to wow me at times despite the fact that I regularly play games on a high-end PC. Indoor environments are nothing special, but the outdoor areas look fantastic. This is also largely due to some nice art direction and phenomenal level design. I honestly have no idea how the level designers managed to cram so much foliage and debris into absolutely every single level. This becomes even more impressive when you consider many of the houses have interiors and how lengthy the whole experience is. There's so many densely packed environments that it leaves me wondering if some of this stuff was generated algorithmically or if Naughty Dog have some kind of trick built into their level editors to make this possible. The environments were easily the most impressive aspect of the experience for me. The journey the characters go on feels appropriately lengthy, and the visuals change enough over the course of the game to keep it feeling fresh. This is one of the reasons The Last of Us feels so impressive at times. It covers such a breadth of content. Naughty Dog were able to achieve this by cobbling together The Last of Us from elements they already created in the Uncharted series. Uncharted 1 set up the engine with its nice water effects, dynamic animation system and other bells and whistles. Uncharted 2 had a winter chapter with convincing weather effects which get recycled in The Last of Us. Uncharted 3 had a horseback section, and once you've built horses for one game, it's easy to reuse them in another. It's a clever idea to take all that technology and smash it together into a new type of game. It's not like the tech team were resting in the meanwhile either. There's a bunch of nice little additions that add to the realism. The way blood smears on the characters dynamically is very impressive, and the flashlight is extremely believable as well. I've always admired Naughty Dog's refusal to cave into load screens, and The Last of Us benefits even more than the Uncharted games in this regard, since the atmosphere is more important. This means there's a hefty load time when booting up the game, but as far as I'm concerned, this isn't even a trade-off. They made completely the right decision. On top of reusing technology, they've also applied some of the design lessons they've learned in the Uncharted games. Apart from some traversal sequences, which themselves were often very high stakes, Uncharted 1 focused entirely on action. Uncharted 2 paced itself a bit better, and the village section about 3/4 of the way through was a nice way for the player to catch their breath. The Last of Us has more frequent calm sections where very little happens. On the one hand, I feel like Naughty Dog may have overvalued the village section of Uncharted 2 and applied it a bit too rigorously to The Last of Us, but I also feel that the calmer sections serve a valuable purpose. The combat in The Last of Us is extremely high intensity. As soon as any engagement resorts to a gunfight, it can often feel like a scramble just to stay alive, exactly the way it should. But if a player was bombarded with these non-stop for the whole duration, they'd easily lose their edge. Quieter moments give the combat something to contrast against, so I think they have a big hand in improving the action sequences. That said, the actions the player performs during most of these are very monotonous. The two most repetitive scenarios involve moving a ladder from one location to another, or a wooden pallet to help Ellie get across some water. These sections almost feel as though they're designed as puzzles, but they don't challenge the player's intelligence in the slightest, and as such they can feel practically insulting and tedious. The most complicated one comes in the final chapter, and it took all of 2 seconds to figure out I needed to backtrack a little to make it work. I really like the pacing of the game overall, but the way that pacing was achieved much of the time should ideally have been a lot more compelling.
Alright, Ellie, I need you to...
I know. Step on the fucking pallet.
I understand how difficult it would have been to make all the downtime in the game unique and interesting, but in some cases it would have been better to have nothing at all than subject the player to another repetitive ladder puzzle. Walking through the woods was more enjoyable. Perhaps instead of doing another pallet section, Joel could have commented on how ridiculous it is for them to keep resorting to that solution and taught Ellie how to swim. There are times where they break away from the formula and really nail this. The start of the winter chapter where Ellie simply hunts down a deer can last several minutes, and it's a nice serene moment after the climax of the preceding chapter. Similarly, riding a horse through the college campus is a nice novelty, and the giraffe section at the end is another unique, calm moment that opens up the final chapter. As much as I enjoyed the giraffe scene, I also can't help but wonder if it was a bit too blunt. The main narrative thread in The Last of Us is definitely the relationship between Joel and Ellie, but there's also a sub-theme of mankind versus nature. Although the infected pose a major threat, the main enemy of the game is definitely the fellow human beings that Joel and Ellie come across. The environments portray this theme very clearly. Joel and Ellie run into several animals along the way, and the vegetation is pervasive throughout almost every environment. Although the game often looks post-apocalyptic the way you would expect, it also sometimes looks closer to paradise. Over the course of my 14 or so hours, I felt I had slowly come to the conclusion that Joel and Ellie's world might be better off without mankind. This is why the giraffe moment didn't sit right with me. Up until that point I felt I had experienced firsthand the beauty of nature that the game was trying to portray. Then at the end I was flat out told, yes, this is the thing we were going for. It's frustrating because up until that point this theme had played perfectly into the strengths of computer games as a medium, only to then snatch it all away at the end by telling me what I was supposed to feel. Although these calm sequences do make up much of the game, there's plenty of combat scenarios along the way as well. As I said, the core gameplay is focused on stealth since there's a limited amount of resources. There's a lot to be said for how punishing the survivor difficulty is, and I certainly like the way it blocks off the hearing mode, but honestly I think hard mode might strike a better balance overall. I found the best moments I had during regular gameplay would be when I cleared about half the enemies using stealth, but then got caught and had to resort to gunplay to kill the rest. Going pure stealth the whole way through misses out on how frantic the battles can be. The gunplay itself is handled very well. In particular, Naughty Dog have taken a risky decision to give Joel a serious amount of gun sway, making it very difficult to land decent shots on moving targets. To an extent, the guns are supposed to feel bad, and they managed to accomplish that without it being obnoxious. When I just barely missed an enemy's head, it felt believable, as though it had added some realism to the events. The weapons are all very powerful though, which makes them satisfying to use when it goes right. It's a nice balance, and I'm not sure any game has ever left me with such a strong impression that every single shot counts. Every bullet feels valuable. One of my favourite things about the shooting is how they handled the weapon limit. Many modern shooters, including the Uncharted series, limit the player to 2 guns at a time. This is a gameplay mechanic which has never sat very well with me since it feels too limiting. Thankfully, the backpack in The Last of Us is a fantastic compromise between 2 different systems. It allows Joel to carry every weapon in the game, but only have 2 equipped at once. If you need to swap them out, then Joel has to open up the backpack. Since this happens in real time, it can add even more tension to an already tense game by forcing the player to pause when they may not necessarily want to, and it feels realistic as well. This is the best of both worlds. The inventory is easy to manage, but doesn't feel limiting like the 2-weapon system does in most games. Another modern shooter idea that The Last of Us does away with is regenerating health. Instead, Joel has to craft health packs, and again, the player is forced to use these in real time if they want to patch themselves up. It's kind of a sad state of affairs that a game not having automatically regenerating health is considered out of the ordinary, and I'm very grateful Naughty Dog opted for this approach. This ties into the crafting system as well, since Molotovs and health kits require the same ingredients. The choice between crafting health packs or Molotovs is by far the most interesting, since those are 2 very different options, but the other choices are welcome as well. The menu is simplistic to use, and while the outcomes aren't complicated, at least the designers seem to have realised that there would be no point in a crafting system at all if the player isn't forced to make choices with it. Everything the player can make stops them from making something else instead, and again, it's worth noting that all of this happens in real time, furthering the tension. Instead of blindly following ideas which have become rooted in shooters over the last decade, Naughty Dog actually thought about what suits their game best. The end result are game mechanics which feel grounded in their world and add a new layer to the gameplay rather than detract from it. While the core gameplay mechanics are mostly solid, the way the game portrays those mechanics is sometimes very strange. For example, coming up behind an enemy and strangling them to death is supposed to work as a stealth kill, even though they make a ton of noise while they're being murdered. An enemy character won't notice his friend being strangled even if they're right next to one another. This becomes even more jarring when it happens right next to a clicker. The sound effects that are present all sound wonderful for what they are, but I can't help but feeling that the sound team really needed to dial it back a bit for the sake of keeping the game world consistent. Although the sound effects are often too loud during stealth sequences, they work really well during the action. The loud gunshots and convincing blood splatter noises tie in well with the brutal violence happening on screen. The grounded way that the violence is portrayed in The Last of Us is one of the most interesting aspects of the whole presentation. Every death in the game seems brutal, whether it be the enemies or the player's character. More than once I was struck with a certain level of shock seeing someone's head burst violently open after a shotgun blast or watching the attack animations play themselves out. Gratuitous violence is nothing new to computer games. Lots of games include a huge amount of killing almost without even thinking about it anymore, while some use over-the-top violence as a way of rewarding the player. I actually have more issue with the former than with the latter, but I suppose that's a whole other video. Anyway, Naughty Dog deserve to be commended for somehow pushing the violence in The Last of Us to a point where it starts to fold back in on itself and becomes uncomfortable to see at times. I don't know if it's just me, but I felt the focus on realism in The Last of Us was fantastic, but also sometimes made smaller issues like the sound design feel like larger problems. For example, it's fairly common that enemies will drop limited or no ammo, even though they should have plenty, and The Last of Us is no exception. But since Joel is desperate for supplies, this contradicts the world more than it would in most games. This is a balancing issue. The goal is to drive players towards a more difficult and thoughtful stealth approach since it wastes the fewest resources. If you killed an enemy with 3 bullets and he dropped 3 bullets most of the time, then shooting your way out of every situation would be a lot more viable than the designers wanted it to be. I could complain about the same thing in a lot of games, so I feel a bit bad about highlighting it, but it's almost as though The Last of Us deserves to be held to a higher standard, which is both a good and bad thing. Even something as simple as the repetitive use of bricks and bottles begins to harm immersion when you strive for realism. I would have loved to see Naughty Dog push their goals for realism even further as well. For example, I was hopeful when Joel and Ellie got out of the quarantine zone at the start that the outside would be appropriately dark.
Look how dark it is.
But it's still lit with a large amount of ambient light. Even if we just hold the game to regular standards, some of the sequences don't manage to live up to them. One such instance occurs in Pittsburgh, where Joel goes to take out a bunch of guys and Ellie covers his back with a rifle. If you try to take out all the enemies using stealth, the game will just spawn more and more and more. It turns out it's impossible to do this section of the game using pure stealth because the cutscene afterwards implies that Ellie fired the rifle at least once. So the player has to get caught so Ellie can play her part. It's totally unacceptable to pull this kind of stuff for the sake of the story. At best, they should have had 2 slightly different cutscenes, or maybe just force the player to go into an action sequence right away. Another flub comes when the crew are pinned down by a sniper and Joel decides to sneak up and get the drop on him. My first reaction here was to get as close as possible to the sniper nest and kill the gunman immediately since it posed the biggest threat. Imagine my surprise when I got near it and found there was nobody manning the gun, only to be shot by it moments later. For whatever reason, there's no enemy model here, and the gun doesn't even rotate to indicate the player is in danger. This is not the kind of problem you expect to see in a linear AAA game. It's ridiculous, and I have no idea how it made it past any sort of playtest, since it seems like the first thing anyone would do is find a way to kill the sniper. Again, this might be because there's a cutscene that plays when Joel gets into the room, where he has to kill the sniper by hand. Another sequence I found less than stellar was in the sewers where Joel and Ellie are separated. The following room full of infected is extremely tough to sneak through using stealth, and for ages I couldn't figure out why. This is because the infected in here are stalkers, halfway between a runner and a clicker. They have the vision of a runner, but the hearing of a clicker, making them by far the hardest enemy to kill without being detected. Unfortunately, the visual language here was lacking. Clickers, runners and bloaters are all visually identifiable very easily, but it's hard to tell whether something is a stalker or not because it has no unique identifiers of its own, especially at long distance. I think the confusing nature of these enemies is one of the main reasons they barely saw any use. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't say these problematic areas are the exception rather than the rule. For the most part, every area in the game plays out well with few unique issues like this. In a 14-hour game, a few bad parts weren't nearly enough to sour me on the whole experience, but they are disappointing. I think the worst thing about all these issues is how obvious they are. Naughty Dog probably would have fixed them had they been given a bit more development time. Even an extra month or two might have been enough to smooth these out and maybe make some improvements to the AI. If the core gameplay was missing anything, it was a lack of evolution. Joel gains weapons and skills as it goes on, but the enemies remain the same, and there's only 5 types. 3 if you exclude the stalkers and bloaters, which barely see any use. There's also a big missed opportunity here, because human and infected enemies are never found in the same area. It would have been nice had the player been given a way to use them against each other sometimes. The static enemy types, combined with the fact that Joel gets upgrades over time, often causes the game to feel like it gets easier as it goes on rather than harder. Now, I'm not saying every game should conform to the same standard, but The Last of Us would have definitely benefited from a traditional difficulty curve. The story raised the stakes as it went on, but the gameplay couldn't keep up. As I said earlier, I'm not going to go through every sequence in the game since there's so many, but since I've highlighted some of the worst ones, I should also talk about the ones I enjoyed. The bit where Joel gets strung upside down and has to fend off infected like this was brilliant. It's such a simple moment, but so memorable regardless. Likewise, the deer hunt later in the game was another simple moment that was totally engrossing for its duration. Ellie's confrontation with David in the restaurant was another favourite moment of mine. It's the closest The Last of Us gets to a boss fight, but still manages to maintain its realistic tone. It's set up well in that the player has to make their way through the environment first, and has plenty of time to stumble across some plates, learning that they make noise before the fight actually happens. I also loved the way David eventually resorted to sneaking around himself, making him much harder to detect and sneak up on. I wish some other enemies in the game had adopted this behaviour from time to time as well. One of the other sections that sticks out for me personally is after the sewers where the crew emerge into a little neighbourhood. Of the quiet moments in The Last of Us, this one felt like one of the best in its execution for me. The visuals were very refreshing after being underground for the past while, and there were several nice touches here. There's obviously a lot of overt storytelling in the game, but some of the optional stuff involving Ish and his group of people in the sewers was particularly good. My favourite moment came in the neighbourhood afterwards when I found a note from Kyle which predated everything I had seen from him previously. It details how he decides to join Ish and his people in the sewers for protection, but since I'd already been in there, I saw how him and the children ended up barricaded in a room, and eventually he had to kill them all. Seeing this letter from before he ended up in that situation hit a very powerful note for me. I'm not saying The Last of Us is the first game to do anything like this, but I felt it really worked.
Well, that wasn't a good idea, now was it?
On top of that, the neighbourhood had a couple of optional conversations, a nice moment with the dartboard, a workbench, some dogs play fighting in the street, and plenty of stuff to scavenge, including an attic I missed on my first playthrough. In other words, of all the calm areas in the game, I felt this was the one most dense with content, and for whatever reason, it's one of the first areas that springs to mind when I think about the game, despite being very low-key. Those were some of the highlights for me, but as I've said, for the most part the game is one enjoyable sequence after another, and it never rests on one section for too long. Linear has been painted as a bit of a dirty word in recent times, but I don't agree with the notion that linearity in a game is necessarily bad. I would have liked a branching path or two in The Last of Us to make repeat playthroughs more interesting, but the more open a game becomes, the less tightly paced and designed it's going to feel. Where The Last of Us succeeds here is by making many of the enemy encounters quite open-ended, so while the game is linear overall, a player has a couple of different ways they can approach each situation. The level design during most of the combat sequences was superb, and during the more linear sequences I felt it pushed me in the right direction without being too forceful, which is exactly what good level design should do. Naturally, the events of the game are also pushed along by a tightly ingrained story. I wasn't long in though before I was mentally ticking the post-apocalyptic boxes as each cutscene rolled around. The story starts shortly before the infection ruins everything, there's an immune person, Tess gets infected and sacrifices herself for the good of the group, Bill rigs an empty town full of traps and starts to go a bit loopy from the isolation, Sam gets infected and hides it from the group, Henry kills someone he cares about and eventually commits guilt-ridden suicide, David and his group are revealed to be cannibals. You get the idea. Zombies have been done, they've been done a lot, and as a consequence there might not be a whole lot of ground left to tread here. I still think the story could have strived to be less generic though. Although the story is largely unsurprising, it's still very well told. The script is solid and the characters really shine, particularly Joel and Ellie. At its most basic, the plot can be reduced to two characters getting from point A to point B, so it's more about how the relationship between Joel and Ellie evolves as it goes on more than anything else. On one level, I feel like this was handled very well. At the beginning, they're not keen about working with one another, and by the end they're inseparable. It's exactly what the story was trying to achieve, and it never felt unnatural. I can't help but feel they were also cheating a bit though. Important moments of Joel and Ellie's relationship are glossed over during the time skips that occur between each of the major chapters. During each chapter, the game writes itself into an interesting situation, then jumps straight over it. The death of Sam and Henry is only briefly touched upon in some optional dialogue, and we don't get to see what sort of effect it had on Ellie or by what means Joel tried to comfort her, if any. All we know is by the time autumn rolls around, their relationship seems to have improved a good deal. At the end of autumn, Joel falls off the horse and we skip immediately into winter, with no idea how Ellie might have moved Joel to a remote cabin short of dragging him the whole way there behind a horse. Either that or he got back on his feet, which really kills the impact of this scene. The jump from winter to spring is perhaps the most jarring though. We go from Ellie just escaping brutal murder from a cannibal to Joel and Ellie walking along as though nothing has happened. I really enjoyed all the chapter transitions as they played out on screen, but the more I thought about them afterwards, the more they detracted from my enjoyment of the story. I would say the chapter which best furthers the relationship between Joel and Ellie is Autumn, where first of all Joel has to track down Ellie on horseback, and then later Ellie rescues Joel while he's critically injured. In both of these sequences, each character shows that they care for the other, and this largely happens while the player is in control, which is a big bonus as far as I'm concerned. This plays itself out in the winter chapter as well, but I'm a bit more conflicted on that one. I really enjoyed playing as Ellie and the subtle gameplay changes that brought to everything, but on the other hand I wonder if it sort of undermined one of the main purposes of the game. For the vast majority of the game we're supposed to identify with Joel and build a relationship with Ellie from his perspective. Putting us in Ellie's shoes seems to hurt that goal more than it helps. For whatever reason, I never felt like I connected with Ellie as much as the game wanted me to, despite really enjoying her as a character. Even so, I did enjoy the ending sequence for what it was, and I liked the way the escape scene with Ellie brought the story full circle from the scene with Sarah at the start. It really does feel like we've gone a long way with Joel as a character by that point. I was also vaguely surprised to see both characters survive all the way to the end, and that was another aspect of the ending I enjoyed. There's no cheap twists, instead it's just a moment where Joel's character remains true to himself. One section I will say was really enhanced by controlling Ellie instead of Joel was the very last piece of gameplay, where they walk through the woods. When I first played the game this seemed kind of pointless, but afterwards I realised it had subtly affected the way I saw Joel as a character. Listening to him open up about Sarah from Ellie's perspective after everything that happens in the ending sequence really drives home the point that he's a lonely old man.
Don't think I ever told you, but, Sarah and I used to take hikes like this. I think the two of you would have been good friends. I think you really would have liked her. I know she'd have liked you.
I bet I would have.
After seeing him brutally murder so many people, it's only here we get an impression of how pathetic he is in some ways, but it's also hard to blame him. While the ending didn't pull me in emotionally as much as I would have liked, I have to admit I can't really think of a more fitting conclusion for these two characters. I only hope if Naughty Dog decides to revisit this world, that they do so with some new characters instead. Actually, that's exactly what you can do already in the obligatory multiplayer mode where you can endlessly slaughter real human beings. Nowadays it's more of a surprise if a big budget release doesn't have multiplayer, and there's definitely something to be said for the way this stops people trading the game back in, thus increasing fresh sales and allowing more games to be made that otherwise wouldn't. But I'm not judging this game on the way it earns its revenue. The Last of Us multiplayer feels maybe slightly less tacked on than most multiplayer modes, but that's not saying much. The main thing going for it is its relatively slow pacing compared to other shooters and a nice application of the crafting system. As with a lot of modern multiplayer titles, the game includes some RPG elements where players can unlock more powerful boosts and weapons as they level up. This effectively gives an edge to players who have spent more time on the game, which as far as I'm concerned is only a bad thing. I see no reason why I should be punished for my lack of dedication to a multiplayer mode, so someone with more free time can feel better about themselves. The main reason this is included though is because game designers have realised that tacking an EXP bar onto any multiplayer mode makes it instantly more compulsive. For me, it's always come across as a lazy crutch in place of crafting a multiplayer experience that keeps people coming back for the gameplay itself. Since every other game out there has resorted to the same thing, It's probably the only way the designers thought the game could stay relevant enough to keep people coming back. A higher retention rate means more sales of DLC and blah blah revenue. For the most part, The Last of Us multiplayer is exactly what you'd expect, and while I personally didn't get pulled in by it, at least it doesn't seem to have affected the development of the single player, since the single player was a lot longer than I expected it to be. That said, I think including a multiplayer mode in The Last of Us runs in opposition to what the single player was trying to achieve. They created a tense, memorable, and grotesquely violent experience in the campaign, but playing the multiplayer can only detract from those feelings. The longer someone plays the multiplayer, the more desensitized they'll become to the single player experience. This isn't an issue now, since most players probably aren't going to replay the game anytime soon, but players who return to the multiplayer over the next year or two will probably find themselves replaying the single player or going into a sequel and enjoying it a lot less than they would have otherwise. That's my theory on it anyway, and one of the main reasons I'll be staying away from the multiplayer. So that concludes The Last of Us. There were times during my playthroughs where I felt I was playing a masterpiece. It's hard to put into words just how perfectly that deer section felt for me. It's also hard to describe how destructive a single invisible sniper is to my immersion though. Thanks to some disappointing AI and a couple of other little issues, there's too many moments that are rough around the edges, and each one feels highly disappointing, maybe more than it would in most games. Sometimes the individual pieces of this game just didn't quite seem to get along with one another, but despite that I managed to become wholly engrossed in it most of the time. Thanks to its tense gameplay, which can go from slow to frantic in the blink of an eye, and its adept combination of stealth, survival and shooting, The Last of Us is a surprisingly great game. More than that though, it's an amazing experience. By the time I came out the other side, I really felt like I had been on a satisfying journey, one I think I'll be eager to revisit in a few years when it might feel fresh again.